Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, the Senate will take a vote shortly on a resolution from Senator Schmidt dealing with infrastructure funding. The discussion of the resolution has been pretty quiet because on its face, it looks like it's an issue dealing with a lot of budgetary lingo and Washington ease. Obligated funds and expenditure deadlines is what people hear about. But the reality is, this proposal is anti-infrastructure. It could put stop work orders on thousands of infrastructure projects across the country. Some of them have shovels in the ground as we speak. And my concern, Mr. President, we pass this and we'd be going virtually from a period where folks in Georgia and elsewhere had hard hats on to they're facing layoffs. Now here's the background. In 2021, the Congress passed emergency funding for state and local governments. At the time, there was a big concern that their budgets would get clobbered by the pandemic, which had hammered our economy and put millions out of work. But state and local budgets fared better than expected. So later on, senators were looking on a bipartisan basis for smart ways to rebuild our infrastructure, roads and bridges and highways, water and sewer, also broadband projects. And there was bipartisan agreement that Congress ought to allow that leftover state and local funding to be repurposed for these important infrastructure projects. So both sides of this chamber, the Republican side, the Democratic side, Mr. President, passed legislation multiple times, even by unanimous consent, that provided what the states and localities wanted, which was more flexibility. We hear our colleagues on the other side talk a lot about wanting to cut red tape, get the federal government out of the way, empower the states, laboratories of democracy. Here's a case where my colleagues on the other side got exactly what they wanted: more flexibility for the states to use taxpayer funds on infrastructure. Have a Wyden concern, a highway that needs widening, a bridge that's past its useful life, a water system with lead pipes that need replacing. Congress voted on a bipartisan basis to make that easier. It's a real head-scratcher why Republicans would now want to make this difficult. Now, some have accused the Treasury Department of playing around with the expiration of the program. That hasn't happened at all. It's the same program with the same timeline and the same rules that Democrats and Republicans agreed on as recently as a few short months ago. I mentioned at the outset that this resolution puts a stop work order on thousands of projects nationwide. The numbers just really stun you when you walk through them. On the Finance Committee, we asked the Treasury Department what the impact could be in specific states. Here's an example. In the Senate President's state of Georgia, 17 projects totaling $1.4 billion could be terminated. Michigan, 160 projects. Ohio, 342 projects. Arizona, 50 projects. Montana, 404 projects. West Virginia, 73 projects. Nationwide, Mr. President, there could be thousands of projects closed. Tens or even hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. Higher costs for families and businesses that had to wait far too long for Congress to get serious about infrastructure. So I'll just tell my colleagues, as we gear up for a vote, this one is one of the most unusual votes that I've seen recently, a true head-scratcher. Bipartisanship, we all know, is a heavy lift. But the progress we've made on this issue, in my view, is actually a bipartisan highlight of the last several years. I talk to my colleagues a lot about how we find some common ground. Here we have, from day one, Senator Cornyn, my colleague on the Finance Committee, and Senator Padilla working from the outset to add additional flexibility for the pool of funds that would be available. So a Republican United States Senator a Democratic United States senator put together a proposal that, get this, colleagues, passed by unanimous consent 3 times. So if the Senate was to walk back this bipartisan effort, originally led by a senator from California, a Democrat, a senator from Texas, a Republican, the bottom line would be that starting almost immediately, Mr. President, those hard hats that I mentioned in states like yours and others could be coming off, and they'd be looking at ways to keep a roof over their head and pay for food for their families and health care. So I'll close by this. I just don't see a good reason for the United States Senate to backtrack on solid bipartisan progress and have this chamber act in a way that leaves more of our nation's infrastructure in a state of disrepair. I urge my colleagues to preserve the bipartisan work that has been done on this issue that got strong votes 3 times. Preserve the work that's been done on this issue for infrastructure, oppose the resolution, and I yield the floor.